If you track with evangelical news and culture at all, by now, no doubt you've heard about Phillip Yancey. He was an incredibly influential author. He wrote books like What's So Amazing About Grace, or The Jesus I Never Knew, or Disappointment with God. And it's been revealed now that he was unfaithful to his wife and actually had kept up an affair with another woman for 8 years. And this kind of thing is heartbreaking, and particularly for people who were influenced by him, or maybe people who were Christians and are no longer calling themselves Christians, looking in from the outside, saying things like, how do we know that everybody isn't just acting? Like, this isn't just one big show, and eventually we're going to find out that everyone had this secret life, because none of this was real. These were all just play actors out to get people's money by selling them what they wanted to buy. And so that's kind of what I want to zero in on here, is the way that Phillip Yancey's failure adds fuel to the fire of the church is full of hypocrites type argument that causes a lot of people to question their faith or even walk away from their faith. Every time someone like Phillip Yancey comes out with a story like this, which has happened way too often, it causes a lot of people to reckon with whether they believe or whether they should believe any of this is true. Because if a guy like Phillip Yancey could carry on this double life, did he believe that it was true? And if he didn't, then how do we know it is? And does anybody actually believe it's true? I think there's some really good ways. I think there's some really important ways to answer these questions. And I think there's some really important ways to answer these questions. And I want to come at it in 3 quick layers. And the first layer is that the problem may not be as big as it seems. We live in an era when certain types of media tend to amplify these stories, and they can feel like they're everywhere. But that's a little bit of attention bias going on. It's like when you get a new car and all of a sudden you see that car on the road everywhere, like that type of car, and it's not like there's any more of them on the road than there were before. You're just noticing them now. And there's also negativity bias, which is that negative stories tend to be noticed by us and remembered, and also get amplified quite a bit more. We don't hear the news stories about all the faithful pastors in all the small towns or big cities who made it to the end of their ministries, their careers, faithfully and faithful to their wives, and did everything really well. We don't tend to hear those stories. We tend to hear the negative stories, which gives an impression that they're more plentiful than they are. If I was to go to my bookshelf, or if you were to go to your bookshelf, if you have Christian books there, or a Christian bookstore or a library, write down all the authors that are on there. There's a pretty good chance that most of them did a pretty good job on this file. And sadly, it is a number of cases that get amplified that make it seem like it's more than it is. So that's one important slice. Second, it does seem to happen to famous Christians with some amount of regularity. And even if that's just attention bias, we should wonder about that. But perhaps there's something about famous Christians, about being famous, about being a celebrity, about being a household name, that makes one more predisposed or in a more vulnerable spot to failing at a major level like this. Maybe we shouldn't think, oh, they're a famous Christian, therefore they are less likely to fail. They're more trustworthy than everybody else. Maybe we should actually think, man, that's a famous Christian. The pressures of fame, the pressures of celebrity, even just the lifestyle of being the kind of person who gets asked to speak different places and travel a lot and meet all kinds of different people. They're not in one spot with one group of people that can keep an eye on them all the time. Maybe that actually sets them up to be more likely to fail. This is something I wrote about after Ravi Zacharias' failure became public, is that I think we really need to have a reckoning as evangelicals with celebrity culture and with the way that we prop up leaders and allow them to live lifestyles that are just objectively not healthy. And we treat them with a certain amount of respect and awe, and we look up to them and hang on their every word in a way that's just not healthy for anyone's soul. As I've seen this cycle repeat itself, and have seen people who I've known and have seen them get some measure of fame, and you see what it does to them, I'm not sure how many human souls can handle the pressures of fame. I think celebrity culture, even just the existence of being a celebrity and that phenomenon has a toxicity to it. There's a poison there that very few people can make it through unscathed. And so maybe we need to adjust our expectations a little bit and have a big reckoning with this whole phenomenon and whether it should even exist and what we should do about that. There's some big things to talk about there that I can't deal with in a short video, but we need to think about that. And then the third thing is that as we look at scripture, we perhaps shouldn't be as surprised by these things as we are, because in the Bible we read stories like David and Bathsheba and Abraham and Hagar and Judas Iscariot. And we have these stories and all the warnings from Jesus's mouth about false teachers and all the things that Paul says to Timothy about how to select leaders and the types of qualifications to look for and the dangers inherent in positions of leadership. And if we kind of have this naive idea that famous Christians are just going to be good people and we're so surprised when bad things happen to them, I wonder if that shows that we maybe haven't been reading the Bible all that carefully, because the Bible encourages us towards a certain level of discernment towards other people, towards even people like King David, and if him, then anybody else. So those are three layers, and I think there's maybe a fourth thing to say here. Is it seems ironic to me that at a time in history when these types of stories seem to be happening with a certain amount of frequency, they're being broadcast, that at the same time I've heard Christians talk rather disparagingly about the types of things that we actually can do to help. Here's what I'm talking about specifically. If you think about famous Christians in the last 50 years or even 100 years, world influential Christians, probably Billy Graham's going to be at the top of that list in terms of fame, influence. Billy Graham made it to the end of his life without moral failure. He certainly wasn't a perfect man. I could give all kinds of things that I disagreed with him on, but in terms of his faithfulness to his wife, he made it. And there's that very famous Billy Graham rule where he just wouldn't be alone with another woman that wasn't his wife ever. And it's really ironic to me that I've heard Christian leaders disparage that idea, say, well, that Billy Graham rule, it's not fair to women and it treats them like they're the problem, etc., etc. I've sat in seminary classrooms and had professors rip it to shreds. I've read stuff about it publicly. And I really wonder about the wisdom of that. Because here's the thing, for as much negativity as you can associate with the Billy Graham rule, it works. And as a pastor, I decided pretty early on in my ministry that while I wanted to be balanced, if I had to pick a side to err on between either being a little too distant, maybe a little inaccessible to the women in my church, or being a little too warm and a little too close in a way that could be dangerous, even if not practically dangerous in the aspect that people could ask questions and say, is everything okay there? Is that okay? Even just to avoid appearances. That if I had to pick a side to err on, I was going to err on the side of being more careful. Because here's the thing about the Billy Graham rule. It works. It really does work. And so far, I can testify to that in my own life and ministry. And of course, there's ways of misapplying it. And of course, there's ways of applying the Billy Graham rule in a way that would be unfair to the women in your church. But I can say so far from my own experience, the women in my church trust me. And part of the reason they trust me is that we could just never, ever be in an inappropriate situation or even a situation that other people would think could be inappropriate. It just will never happen. And my wife is on my team and we work together as a family. And if I have to meet with a woman, it's going to be in a setting where nobody could ever even guess that something inappropriate could happen or could build. My wife has total access to my phone in terms of texting conversations and so on. We have location services turned on, so anywhere I go, she knows exactly where I am and for how long. Like we do the share your location with one another. And none of this is because I think I'm in mortal danger of having an affair next week, but nobody ever thinks they are. And the types of people who have an affair, it started off not just, I mean, we're all the type of people who could have an affair. But when that happens, it starts off 1, 2, 5, 10, 15, 20 years before, where slight, small little changes are made. And that begins a trajectory that ends up in shipwreck. And so I just want to say, if you're watching this and you're wondering, like, is it possible for pastors to, or for ministry leaders to be above board and above reproach and to not be hiding these really gross relationships and so on? It is. And I really look to Billy Graham as my example, and I've tried to follow in his footsteps in the way that he did that. And it is possible. And there are many who have done it, and they don't hit the news. They don't get big podcasts made about them and everyone writing about them, but there are many of those stories. And so I hope some of this has been helpful, and I look forward to sharing more content here in the next little bit.